You want to get the perspective of those folks who are, remember that one slide where all the phones were ringing? um, Sandy and Lester are operating these cross-county rides, the long rides, the ones that are trying to connect people across different types of environments, non-urban to urban locations, across different county lines. And we wanted to understand a little bit better what are some of the thorny detail of actually connecting those rides across different folks, for different folks across different counties. And how could we then glean some of the potential, like the minimal data that's needed in order to make those connections for folks? So, Sandy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi everyone, Sandy Fan, she, her pronouns, and I'm with HopeLink Mobility Management. So we serve as a team of mobility managers across King County, and a lot of our work is, like Anat said, just supporting people trying to find solutions to their rides. If it's a long trip that's like county to county, there are not a lot of existing transit that would do that trip really easily. So we have to do a lot of kind of problem solving and coordinations with client to see what services are going to work for them. Are they eligible for this service? Is this service provider willing to support this unique trip request, and kind of doing this problem solving with the residents? And then I'll pass it to Lester to do introductions for himself.
I'm Lester Olano. I'm a community transportation navigator at healthcare housing sites in Auburn and Renton. And I help the individuals find routes to where they're going.
Oh, Matthew, what were you going to say?
No.
Yeah, just share with us some of, so you mentioned eligibilities as a main concern. That's the ability to actually personalize the services to the person who is asking for the ride. What about some of the information from those services you're trying to coordinate? Are you asking for information regarding their schedules, their fleet management? Are there specific locations where some of the exchanges and hands-offs might take place, to simplify some of the potential data sharing that might take place across different coordinated services?
Yeah, I can speak on that a little bit. And I think we have another panelist, Daryl, is also just walking and coming in. He can share more about the non-emergency Medicaid transportation that actually does a lot of the booking itself. But a little bit of like what we've seen as mobility managers is a lot of folks are trying to go from either Seattle into Tacoma or to the greater Pierce County or into Snohomish County. And a lot of the times, there aren't really existing transit agencies that would take you one spot from Seattle directly into Tacoma. So you have to take multiple different bus routes to get there. And if someone is experiencing a disability, and we're talking about paratransit, how do they get there if they can't use fixed route transit? So we're going to lean a lot on our partners that we build in our coalition. So Devine May is a big partner that we work with in Pierce County. Anytime we try to get someone from Seattle or anywhere in King County just into Pierce, and let's say they're experiencing a disability, we work with Pierce County and Devine May to see what are the existing resources that are already out there. Can we work together and kind of compromise and meet halfway? And then we do that warm handoff. Information that is really necessary is where they're going to. Is it a medical facility, or is it to see friends and family? Kind of more information on what type of trip it is, if it's a medical trip, if it's a recreational trip, or kind of like a leisure trip. And I would say more other information that's really important is just noting what mobility challenges they might have. So do they have a wheelchair? Are they someone who has a walker or low visibility? And just trying to really get a profile of what that resident and that rider is looking for, and then having that clear communication between one county to the other county.
Any information about what rides are currently already scheduled for that environment or for that day, for that time?
Daryl, do you have any insights on like what are the current schedules of having trip operations that are county to county?
Well, I apologize for being late. I couldn't find the place. But I'm here now, right? Transportation can't find the place. Go figure. However, as far as the out of county, so coordination.
What is your role in coordinating rides?
Oh,
First?
so my role in coordinating rides. So work at the Medicaid transportation brokerage for clients that are on Medicaid. So I'm the director of facility of Hopewick Transportation. So we transport clients under the Medicaid contract that are Medicaid eligible to and from Snohomish County and King County. So we cover all of that area with paratransit.
And do only Medicaid eligible riders contact you?
Yes and no. I mean, yes, majority of the time our primary base is Medicaid transportation. However, if clients are not eligible for Medicaid, then we of course have our friends in the mobility management team, which is Sandy's team, and they're able to assist further.
And what kind of data or information is shared with you to allow for coordination across different services?
So like the data from other facilities or for the clients? Apologize.
For other transportation providers.
So for other transportation providers, so primarily we need to know like the location that they're going to, trip purpose, so for billing purposes, because we bill directly to Medicaid. We also need to know logistics, so any type of special mobilities, for example, wheelchair, ambulatory, non-ambulatory. What else? Of course, your name, provider one number is our primary account lookup. However, we could still find you by your name and date of birth. Those are kind of just the main things when you call.
Mm-hmm. So going back to Kevin and Matthew, would you say that sharing those out and say pinging the service? So let's say we're going to go for 3R MVP. Would something like a notification system that just broadcasts the needs regarding, origin, destination, trip purpose, potential mobility concerns, so that it might determine the vehicle type that might be dispatched or something like that?
I think that's a completely natural extension of what we're talking about. It just seems like there is a distinct need for coordinated mobility across the area, and we don't just have to limit to paratransit. We could create it for paratransit because there's a fundamental need to do it. Everything else after that, is just a bonus. I mean, it is just a bonus. I mean, we're creating something. If we did create something, it would be out of a distinct need to comply with the equity in the region. But I won't see any limiting factor to opening that up to other uses for coordinated transportation.
Mm-hmm. I see a question. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I am wondering about the technical problem. Sorry. The technical problem seems fairly straightforward. I mean, Uber and Lyft have solved this to create a transportation marketplace, right? So, you could imagine a sort of public transportation marketplace for demand responsive trips as well. I'm wondering, given the various institutional rules and regulations, not to mention just entrenched ways of doing business, I'm wondering what are the barriers are there any real barriers, or are they just perceived, to commingling Medicaid provided contracted service? Is there anything that's preventing the free flow of the provision of the supply?
Yes.
I mean, I know there is, but tell me about it.
Funding.
Yeah.
Funding.
Well, I feel like I run into this a little bit because I've worked with a lot of software vendors who have started off creating paratransit software, and they're like, oh, wow, paratransit and non-emergency medical transportation are so similar. We're just going to move into that field. And then they discover that that those surface similarities hide, first of all, a huge level of regulatory differences. So they are largely regulated under different parts of government. So FTA versus CMS, right? And then and with that is, so there's a lot of these things that are sort of quote out of technology systems, but very much influence what the technology needs to account for. So there's validation or credentialing of the drivers, of the vehicles. There's sort of service level expectations, and people say, well,
Fundamentally different though, or could like CMS accepts some of FTA's provisions and vice versa?
oh, that would be lovely. Yeah,
So is that
yeah.
an opportunity?
Yeah, there's
Are they fundamentally
Yeah.
different, or are they just?
They're not fundamentally different, although clearly as you start to move up into more and more medicalized contexts, the levels of need go up, and you really do need more training, or you really need that vehicle to have a certain emergency level of equipment on it. And so it's both like you really need to be matching up the demand with the supply in a very effective way. Otherwise, things are going to go sideways in a way you really don't want.
I wanted to hear more about community transportation navigators from Sandy and Lester in terms of kind of the in-depth support it takes to provide somebody with transportation advice. Like, is it a 5-minute conversation? Is it over a couple of days? Do you like build that relationship with someone and then they keep coming back to you for advice? As you build that trust, like kind of understanding kind of the way the navigator model works. Even though I work with Sandy, I don't get to ask this question.
So what I found worked for me is I will communicate with the individuals, and usually it'll take a few days for them to come back and talk with me. But it's usually a good rapport that I built with them.
And then how long do you think like your regular interactions are?
Interactions are usually, once I get to know them, they're about 10 minutes or so, which are pretty good.
Yeah, and I can add on to that. It really depends, I would say, how much knowledge and base level of foundation that resident or that client knows of transit. And if they have never ridden a bus before, they don't know what ORCA is. It may take 10 minutes, it may take 30 minutes just to share what is an ORCA card, where is it accepted, how do I reload this card, what do I do if I lose my card, how do I have the right fare pricing if you have reduced fare programs. So there's a lot of education to it, and I think as mobility managers, one of our roles is to really understand the end user and their profile, and then recommend all the different types of transportation that they could take, the ones that are going to best meet their needs, and the one that is going to be most comfortable to them, and kind of putting those options on the table and giving them the autonomy to pick what they're most comfortable riding.
To be honest, it sounds to me like there are different perspectives even on this panel in terms of what does it really take. On one hand, I thought I heard like, oh yeah, it's a text broadcast message of the request. And some folks reply, kind of like the Uber and Lyft marketplace notion. But it also sounds like some of these, there's varying and heterogeneous levels of support that are needed for different rides. I'm wondering if there's a way to triage some of these to identify which ones would still need the community supportive team to work with clients versus those rides that are potentially more easily coordinated via automation. And maybe that's one way to approach this problem, whereby there would be many clients that could potentially be handled by an automated triage system, whereas others would not and would never be attempted to, because obviously, as we've heard in the last 2 days, like that would not end up in good outcomes.
I think one thing that's interesting is within the transit world, there is no machine readable way to describe the capabilities of a particular service. So, I actually worked on a project. It was FTA funded through the Oregon Department of Transportation, and that was to create a couple proposed additions to the general transit feed specification, and that was GTFS capabilities and GTFS eligibilities. Thank you. I knew that. I worked on the project. For some reason, I couldn't think of the word. But you know, and that the goal of that one was, you know, we could take a service and a vehicle and say, you know, this vehicle can accommodate a motorized mobility device. This vehicle can accommodate a stretcher. This vehicle can accommodate, you know, it's going to have it's going to have a spare oxygen tank on it, you know, for example, right? And you can describe that. And then, you know, and then the matching on the eligibility side is, well, you know, what is the how can we describe a particular rider? You know, are they eligible for Medicaid? Are they eligible for Orca Lift? Exactly. Do they, or, you know, and you can have a number of different attributes about that. Could be, you know, based on where they live, based on their age, based on their mobility. We haven't really had that, and so all these systems are going back to Matthew's point earlier about, like, we're still living in this sort of spreadsheet world where every agency is its own island, having to figure this out sort of uniquely for themselves. And I think part of the maturation and development of this field is we need to step out of that world and move into a world where we can have shared understandings, and that's where we'll be able to get the wins from the kind of coordination and data exchange schemes that we're talking about.
I guess to Sandy and Lester and Daryl, do you currently have to ask every client about their specific needs and preferences, or are you served with any kind of eligibilities, profile, anything like that?
So from the NEMT sector, essentially, we do. So for each client that calls in, essentially, we do the initial screening when they would call in, and we go through what's called a mobility assessment, and it's part of the software, and essentially we find out the client's needs at that point. However, to Kevin's point, it gets a bit granular where you're trying to, you know, match up the client with exactly the resources that they need, because primarily not everyone that calls is automatically going to, you know, guaranteed to get a ride. A lot of times some of the challenges, or maybe the misconception when you hear NEMT or HopeLink, is that, oh, well, I can call, I can get a ride, and, you know, that's the end of it. But it's more so the agents have to check and screen for eligibility to make sure that the client is eligible for the services, and they also have to make sure that the client is higher mode, which is your door-to-door transportation, sitting like a taxi cab or a wheelchair vehicle, et cetera, to the client's origin address, is appropriate for them. Because essentially, if we gave that to everyone, obviously we would run out of resources. I mean, we serve about maybe a 4 or 5% population of Medicaid, which is significantly larger, but that's just kind of the area that we cover. So to really put it in a nutshell, yes, we essentially do have to screen each client individually and determine their needs.
Lester or Sandy, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I can share on, for a mobility management perspective, it is also a yes. So anytime we're working with a client, we are asking them, you know, the very general questions so that we get a better understanding of what type of resources they'll be eligible for. So we do ask, you know, are you experiencing a disability? Because that will allow you to utilize alternative services or paratransit services. We also ask, where are the residents or the clients commuting from, like the start of origin, because a lot of the transportation resource that King County Metro offers, like on-demand services, are geographically based jurisdictions. And a lot of times those alternative service cannot cross outside of those boundaries or those jurisdictions. So before even recommending it to an end user, we want to know, are they already in that eligibility service area? And then we also ask, do you have an ORCA card? Like, what is your type of payment model that you use to pay for transit? And if they are not on a reduced fare program for My ORCA, that's also another encouragement and learning opportunity that we can provide to let them know, hey, if you're on a state benefit program, you should you should consider signing up for the subsidized annual pass. Or if they're low income, then we can also provide resources on how to get signed up for Orca Lift, just to really make it a lot easier and more effective for the end users. But without that triage and without that conversation, people get lost and people get overwhelmed and they won't ride transit. And I think that's really important for us to understand, and to have people like Lester go out to the communities, talk with people, and really break down the system to the bare bones on what they need to know to ride transit confidently and just have that autonomy over their own lives. But Lester, you want to add anything?
I've actually offered to ride with individuals on the trips as well. So just to make it a little bit easier on them.
Sorry if I misunderstood something, but it almost sounds like some of the users who might have the most specific or granular needs may need to go through that triage time and time again, because, you know, I may not be able to get an Orca card because most of the services that service Orca are not fit for me, and I do need paratransit or other specialized services. Does that mean that every time I call you, Sandy, I have to respond to the same eligibility survey?
I would say it depends on where the education and who's been working with you. If so, for mobility managers, we don't actually do a lot of the coordination where we click book, like we don't book the rides, but we often connect people to the correct agencies that can provide them that service. So, for example, a lot of our work is referring people who are either a senior, or if they're experiencing a disability, we'll recommend them to call Hyde Shuttle, which is a free shuttle service for seniors or anyone experiencing a disability. They serve a large part of King County, and it's our job to make sure that they're aware of the resource, give them all the support and the tools that they need. But a lot of that does end on the end user to call Hyde Shuttle to make that reservation so that they can get their ride. And even with the Healthier Housing Program, a lot of the residents share that even calling to make a reservation is a barrier. And, you know, we try to be very understanding and like support them where their needs are. And then sometimes that involves inviting a case managers to come in to support them with that booking process. And it's really just being there to support because there are so many different transportation programs out there. And there is, you know, a need for that coordination and that conversation.
And is Hyde Shuttle something that anyone can call at any time for a spontaneous ride, even if they hadn't been vetted before?
Great question. This is a great learning opportunity for everyone. If you guys aren't familiar, Hyde Shuttle is a free service run by Sound Generations, and you're able to take them for any types of trip. So that can be a grocery trip, that can be a Medicaid appointment or a medical appointment. You can just come to UW and visit friends or family. But, Lester, where does Hyde Shuttle go, and where can they take you and where they cannot take you?
So they can only take you in the area that you live in, and they can't go outside of the area.
And how many days in advance do you have to book?
It's 1 day in advance, 24 hours.
Thank you for that answer. I see a question. I had a follow-up for that, but no. So, like the Rogaine commercial, I'm not just the CEO, I'm also a user. And in the past 50 days, I've had 2 calls informally from parents who were at Children's with their children who use wheelchairs, got stuck there for various reasons. One had a car breakdown, the other had something else going on. It is impossible to get a rescue ride in a spontaneous way. I'm wondering if there are any kind of either data-driven or non-data-driven ways by which we can ameliorate some of these concerns. Because right now I'm operating a black market wheelchair van. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd say King County Metro operates community van, and community van from King County Metro operates vans in communities, but you need to have the driver and then 2 other people, I think. I don't want to misstate the. So there are, and you have to be trained in advance. but an organization could set up like a volunteer program, like what you're doing as a black market, you could set up as a volunteer program, have that volunteer driver be that on demand, but then you're also at the mercy of that van being available in that moment. But if it's sitting there in the parking lot, you should, I don't know if it's quite same day, but I think that's your best bet. But I might be wrong. But maybe the navigators on the panel, since I'm not a navigator, they would know.
Sean Bafu? Oh, there he is. Go, Sean.
Did you want to contribute an answer to that?
Oh no.
All right, then we can go to Elizabeth's question.
Yeah, I'm curious about what the actual, law says about the booking ahead, and whether or not that's I forget what the law actually says, a comparable service. I know that there is some case law from LA Metro where they deemed that it was not, and that was in, I think, 2004. And so they had to change their service. And they said that in that case, it was booking the day ahead was not a similar amount of service. And so I'm just curious, at the same time, I know that that's a common practice. And so I'm just curious about what the standard actually is and how we can improve it so that we don't make a not operate a black market van.
Are we talking about Hyde Shuttle, or are we talking about paratransit?
In general, paratransit, but
In general, paratransit. Because Hyde Shuttle is a private service, so they
Yep.
essentially just have to have accessible vehicles. But the case law in terms of the day ahead thing, from what I've seen, is that courts have basically said this is what Congress has said, and they've turned away most challenges to that. Though I think there's widespread agreement among transit authorities that if that law was written today, there would be no day ahead requirement. It's just patently inequitable. I mean, it's indefensible
so
given
the law
what's possible
actually
today.
allows day ahead requirements, because that case in LA Metro in whatever the early aughts disputed that was a reasonable.
Yeah, and I think it was turned away, wasn't it? Because
It got settled,
oh yeah, got settled.
but settled with LA Metro at fault, admitting fault. So.
Yeah, I don't know that particular case, but I know that day ahead is still the law of the land. So
That's an interpretation of the law, though, right? Not an actual, or is that's what I'm curious about. Is it?
So that's the minimum standard that's set by the FTA.
At the regulatory level.
But that's
Correct.
regulatory, not a.
Correct,
That's a rulemaking, not
Correct.
a,
Correct.
not a statute.
These are all rules that are set by the Secretary of Transportation. So there is, there is wiggle room in all of these things at the regulatory level.
Can I bring in the very pessimistic view for a minute? So, I mean, we're talking about this as if the data solutionism can bring us some solution here, a technical view of things. But it sounds like at the same time, there are some real social, institutional, compliance, and regulatory barriers that would potentially even make that technical solution be prohibitively expensive on participating services, participating coordination, the additional potential teams that need to be hired in order to help this kind of coordination. Was it 1R or 4R? That was let's just let Uber or Via help us out here.
Oh, that's 4. And,
4.
And that's the default trajectory that we would
Yeah.
be on without
Yeah.
intervention.
So, is expense the only hurdle to 4R?
I mean, I don't have data to support this, but my lived experiences from working at agencies and supporting agencies is that across the board in the United States, there is a massive latent demand for mobility, for accessible mobility, right? And so, everybody's trying to navigate this situation of scarcity, and you just get these strange, perverse incentives where, like, I've talked with agencies about setting up increased digital access to their services, and they're like, we don't want that. If we're more visible, we're going to get more demand. We're already at capacity for the funding that we have. So so that's a case of induced demand, right? Or at least making visible the latent demand that's already there. So I think technology can't solve the decades-long underfunding of public transportation.
But when Google tried to waltz itself into the space, they said basically, all of you participating agencies, you can't be ostriches forever. You can try to hide your head in the sand, but really, if we take all your subsidies and put it together, we can create a Google flow that can, utilize our fandangled global technical market to service all of these needs. And we can probably, they had no proof for this, but they claimed that they could actually satisfy the need that's out there. If I'm an elected representative and I have no real knowledge of the space, I may be allured by such a proposition. What are some of our real world answers to that?
This conversation, and the point about people aging out of being able to drive is an interesting window. And because it's not just technology, it's you have a vehicle. Oh, thank you. You have a vehicle, but you can no longer drive. In one case, a woman talked to me one time. She had a wheelchair accessible vehicle. She was losing vision. She couldn't drive. She also couldn't figure out a way to insure her vehicle so that someone else could drive. And so, some random meeting where you go, okay, someone was talking yesterday about basically it's what would happen if one of her parents couldn't drive. And it's like, just get some people together and think of all the worst things that can happen, and the ease or lack of ease, comfort with using technology for people of different age, and just throw all the bad stuff at the wall and then say, okay, you policymakers, what are funding? People have talked about like FTA funding and CMS funding, and maybe put some of those people in a room and say, guys, see if we'd work together. I don't know, I'm just kind of, as usual, thinking out of the box and throwing the idea out there for us to muddle, because I know there's going to be a study in Washington about people aging out of ability to drive, or I don't know exactly what it's called, but so there are like little nibbles out there, but I think Kevin's right about small agencies trying to do it themselves and not really knowing there's a pool of expertise out there. That would be my limited observation just from even what I know about different agencies in this state. But thank you for letting me jump in.
So I guess two questions on the table, but
right now it seems like Find a Ride and a lot of what you as mobility managers are doing is ingesting user needs and then providing a list of options. And in many cases, then the user themselves needs to take action to book and determine, they actually don't have availability, so then I have to go on to option 2 because, Hyatt is oversubscribed. Do you think it is better to have all of those options, or do you think it would be better for customers to provide all this information of what they need, and then it's up to, on the back end, we figure out what the best option is that would provide, and maybe not the best, but the system provides an option for them, and it says this is the one thing. And so it's not on them to pick between Hyde and Metroflex and Community Van, but it's on the agency to say, okay, of all of your needs, here's the one that actually has capacity and checks the boxes. You might not get the driver that you had last Friday and the vehicle that you're accustomed to, but you will get a vehicle that fits your mobility needs.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it kind of depends on what kind of mindset you're looking for, if it's like quality versus quantity, because a lot of times it is nice to have that perfect option that checks all the box, but as like a rider experience, I think there's a lot of unhidden cost or unhidden like challenges when we're riding transit and we don't have the option. Is having like their safety is one concern. If people aren't feeling comfortable, like if we take a refugee who just came to the States, right, and they don't really speak English, nor do they have smartphones or the access to go to an online system to find what are the best options that a computer or a machine can input out. I think like those are the clienteles that we also have to keep in mind when we're creating technology and having it like be very inclusive for people who may have low vision impairments. And I think Laura does a really good job to include all of that in Find a Ride, and that's one resource of how we can kind of like mainstream it and make it less of a long and a conversation time commitment and having that be more streamlined and automatic. But for me, I feel like there can be the best of both worlds, where there is someone that someone can talk to and have that conversation and understands their specific needs. Another example is if someone who's experiencing a lot of trauma or domestic violence, they want to know, what is the driver's like? Is it a female driver? Is it a male driver? Are those vehicles going to be like ADA approved? I think there's a lot of like other factors, these hidden factors that we don't always think about when we're riding transit, and that's really going to make a difference whether someone's rides fixed route or an alternative resource.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I don't think there's a single answer of like, because I do think sometimes people conceptualize this like it's just a ride, get this person a ride. And in many cases, it's not just a ride, right? There's hidden factors, and along with that, there's hidden benefits to the ride experience. So for a lot of people, it's not just getting to their appointment or to their visit, it's also access to being with another human being. There's a major social isolation piece in there that I think is not being accounted for in a lot of scenarios. So in this human services transportation world, I think you often, there's this first level of like, somebody doesn't even know any service that's available to them. And you just need to get them a service, or an emergency situation, as in Anat's case, you just need to get them a service. But then, I think there's another layer of like, once they find a service that ticks these other boxes that they need, then they're going to stay with it. And they're not going to be using maybe this larger pool that's going to be very technical and allow, see everything that the person qualifies for and all that. So I think it's both and, depending on the scenario.
This question is for Daryl. So Daryl, when you're working with a bunch of different clients, repeat clients, and do you see them get like very attached? Because you work with how many different brokerages or different things that you contract with across 2 counties?
We contract with 27, 28, don't quote me.
Okay.
With small
But
businesses.
Almost 30 different things. And do people get very, very like tied to like, I want Bob in this service and like only send Bob? Like, do people get that attached, or they don't have that option?
No, absolutely. They do get attached. So we have somewhat, not exactly that option, unless of course there's like a legal reason or something along the lines, then of course we can get as granular as needed. But if it's just a normal ride, we do have what we call subscription clients. So for example, let's say someone goes to a life-sustaining treatment such as cancer dialysis, essentially we would assign them to a service provider on a consistent basis so they can build that rapport and that relationship with the client and the facility to make sure they're on time. You know, there's different variables that happen occasionally where someone might be late or there's traffic, and having that clear communication path as opposed to trying to reach out to the broker, then the broker plays telephone and calls the driver and their dispatch, et cetera. So essentially, yes, we do have something along the lines that creates that client experience, but then we also have the aspect of your normal trip to the dentist or something along the lines that is now, of course, to the point of the conversation, to put in an algorithm, and the algorithm runs and assigns them to the most appropriate vehicle service provider, and they may not get Bob, you know, they'll just get random Daryl or whoever, I don't know, but just, yeah, things along the line.
So it sounds like there is an actual scheduling algorithm that you're able to use, but you make the decision on when a particular ride would go towards that versus when it's consistent and continuous and therefore it might have a subscription level service.
Correct. Essentially, it just depends on the need and the type. So life-sustaining treatment and things along the line, we try our best to keep them on subscription. Sometimes not, because if it's like a spotty appointment, something that's not consistent, then it would go into the algorithm. But if it's consistent, then we can assign it in advance to the service provider. So there's that consistency, there's that rapport that's built, there's relationships, and more stability, and really focusing on the client experience. Not to say that clients that use that our trips are gone through the algorithm aren't experiencing the same client experience, but it's more of the kind of a personal experience when they're assigned to a subscription list and actually assigned to the same service provider. So chances are they may come encounter with the same driver more often than someone who would just a regular standard appointment.
So in your system, which is servicing a very specific type of ride, which is non-emergency medical ride, and a specific type of user who's a Medicaid eligible user, presumably, there is a scheduling system that's able to coordinate across 28 different service providers. What do they need to provide? Are they, when they sign up to be a service provider, are they immediately signing up for 24/7 availability, or are they allowed to kind of schedule their availability in the way that maybe other service provisioning agencies would be able to schedule their availability for those services?
It's a great question. So essentially, they're small businesses, so they kind of set their own parameters. So of course we operate 24/7, but the requirement is not, or expectation is not for the service provider to operate 24/7. If they have that in their business model, then absolutely. But if they don't necessarily do so. So essentially, of course, throughout the 28, we do have some that, of course, operate logistically 24/7, but we have others that don't. So we align routes with the algorithm, and when the algorithms ran, it takes into accountability of their service region, area that they work in King and Snohomish County, time of day, assistance needs for the client, and of course the operation hours for the service provider. So if they operate during that hours, the chances are the client in that area with that mobility need will get assigned to that service provider. So it's just different variables based on the need.
So Matthew, what's the barrier in moving from this freeze the user, freeze the use case, allow for this coordination, and scaling that up to 3 counties with huge providers? Go.
Thanks. Nothing like a small question. Standards. Number one. We have to agree to speak the same language, which we don't. We all categorize data differently. We all relate to that data differently. We all store it differently. We all, and we have no forum or method to share that data that's challenge number one. Is just we're speaking in transit. We're speaking 1,000 different dialects for every demand response system that we set up. No two systems are the same. They're all snowflakes, and that's a huge challenge when we're trying to interface with HopeLink and communicate. They're trying to communicate to us. We're trying to communicate to them, as well as the regulatory issues of paratransit. We are a transit system. We try to deliver this standardized thing, and we know that our transit system delivers other benefits to our customers, like we relieve social isolation. A lot of people get that out of paratransit, but that's not a factor in our decision making. And so there's these huge disconnects with what these guys are able to provide and the way that transit authorities view the product that we're delivering. I mean, we could prioritize having the same driver pick up the same person every day. We could do that. But it just doesn't enter our model because we're stuck in this box, in this way of spreadsheet thinking that that's not possible. That's not a service that we do. And so I think through collaboration we can actually develop those connections to say we can actually serve that need at a minimal cost. We can actually deliver the same driver for that paratransit customer. It'll cost something. But we got this information from HopeLink, we got this information from Mobility Coordinator, and that is something that provides value to their life and will improve their standard of living in the region. And so, I think those opportunities emerge once we start speaking the same language. Did I solve world hunger? Okay.
So to summarize, and I would like everybody to have a go at where they think this area is going and where some improvements can be made in the short term to move us in the right direction. Daryl, do you want to start? We'll just go.
Sure. Are we specifically focused just on data and the way that we're utilizing it to coordinate transportation, or are we just focusing on just transportation in general?
Well, we started the discussion from the coordination of rides across 3 different counties and offering specialized services to bridge the paratransit gap that will be created through the extension of the link.
Well, of course. I mean, it's a great question. Overall, I think just really being open-minded and doing the framework early. There's so many nuances. There's so many moving parts. It's tough to really say, hey, let's create this awesome software where people just get a choice on where they want to go, who they want to ride with, and what time, and things along the line. There's also the human factor, which was mentioned, that we want to make sure that we're focusing on the client experience and the connection. So if I had to put it in a nutshell, I would say those folks that really make those regulatory and those larger decisions that are well above, the folks that are in this room today, being open-minded and really taking a chance to understand some of the logistical barriers that we face as paratransit, as mobility coordinators, as brokers, and really taking into account a voice to make a change. Ultimately, a lot of, to Matthew's point, a lot of things are stuck in their ways in this spreadsheet format, and there's no, this is the way it has to go, and we can't get outside of this box. So, here's your coloring page, and please color within the lines. But if we move outside of that and start forward thinking and do the framework early and getting those people that really need to hear this type of information, I think that that's possibly the best place to start. And I know maybe that's not the answer we're looking for, but from my perspective, I think that it really starts with the conversation and understanding the logistics and the logistical barriers that we deal with.
Well, I think, in terms of next steps and what gives me hope now, I don't think it's the technology per se. I mean, the things that I would like to see happen could have happened 25 years ago. And did happen 25 years ago in other parts of the world. So In terms of data standards, there's a standard called SUTI, S-U-T-I. It was developed in the Nordic countries, and it's continues to be working really well for them. The reason that they developed that standard is because they had the governance model to create it. And that's what we have lacked, and that's what we're developing. So those are those muscles in this space at the scale of national or international standards development and thinking together about how to get up out of our sort of every unique worlds. We're all our own snowflakes is through a governance model, and that is developing right now. That's very exciting to me. So the work that mobility data is doing and the support that mobility data is getting from key stakeholders in the field is new and is very important to be able to kind of like achieve the kind of outcomes that that we've been talking about.
Did we want to take the question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, there's a question.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I remember, Anat, I don't know if this is verbatim, but you kind of quoted Google as saying, like, you can't ostrich your heads forever regarding, like, transportation data. And I just want to say that, I've always known I wouldn't be able to drive, so I kind of learned to ride transit using Google Maps 10 years ago. So I think it would be great if DRT could, collaborate with Google, because I think many younger transit users started their transit riding journey on these mainstream apps. So, that's about it. I'm really curious to see how they could collab, because a lot of like the pilot programs, the apps are just not very accessible. Yeah, more a comment, but if it's been at least 10 years since these apps have been teaching new riders, I think we should definitely not forget about them.
Yeah, I agree. Like, thanks for your comment. I mean, that's how I also utilize transit too. I use Google Maps. There are a lot of different apps out there, but that's the one that I'm most familiar with and I grew up using as well. But to answer the general question of like what I think could be an improvement for us moving in this direction is like just having inclusive planning. Like in this stage, we're planning, right? So let's make sure we have like representation at the table. If we're looking at paratransit riders, like they should be involved in the conversation as well, and how we're going to create a service and a system that's going to work best for them and not just for, the general. Like having people who have that representation, that lived experience involved in the conversation, I think will set us up in a long way. It'll let us utilize resource in the most appropriate way versus having assumptions of what we think is going to be best for the community. And I would also say just having consistency in communication of like folks who are willing and committed to making a change to consistently show up in these conversations and provide their feedback, because 4 different agencies, everyone is busy. No one has a minute to spare because we're out here trying to provide service. But having that consistency and that communication and that strong partnership, I think is really going to take us to the long run, to the finish line too.
Yeah, with my healthier housing sites, I've been able to get more people riding the bus that never rode a bus before. And so with the resources I give them, I think we're going in the right direction with this.
Awesome. Anything else from the audience? Go ahead, Doreen. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I have something to say if there's, I was thinking about, oh, good, Mike, thank you. I was thinking about the whole Amazon example that was talked about earlier, and I was thinking about most people need transportation that's not just to and from work. It's like, how do you do the rest of life? How do you do your social activities, your recreation? And so the part of my brain that's like, well, we could make the paratransit stuff work easier. Look at the Amazon model is kind of also like, well, how do we broaden the whole definition of what you need out of your transportation network? Because, and some of this is kind of gendered. It's, they do studies where one travel pattern is kind of go to work and come home, and another kind of travel pattern is trip chaining, and there tends to be a little bit of gendering about, the person who might go from home to drop off kid at childcare, to work, to shopping, to pick kid up, maybe take kid to an activity, and then home. And as long as we're sort of dreaming of, because it's also a mix of people and technology, and so it's dreaming of what the technology can do, but also, the unmet demand for accessible services it affects other things. It affects, ways to social isolate, ways like if you don't drive but you like to hike, or you like to ski in the wintertime, and can there be the same service there is in the summertime? It's kind of think what's out there, and maybe there's a lot of great work happening, and that also just kind of opens up other horizons. That would be my kind of closing 2 cents, that going to and from work is only part of life.
I think I'll add on to that. In my personal crusade has been, challenging transit authorities to evaluate and tackle new areas of market failure. Transit agencies originated out of the collapse of the private bus systems in the 60s, 70s, and we created public agencies to correct that market failure. It was no longer profitable. But what other areas in our transportation network are also market failures? Anat highlighted the ability for someone to get a ride in a wheelchair vehicle is a market failure that we have here locally. It is just not an option. Should it be the transit agency's purview to deploy Zipcar-like service in park and rides and other major locations where Zipcar, isn't economical? The market won't support a private actor in that area. But we know people still need transportation in Issaquah and in far-flung areas of our region. So should we provide, accessible vehicles that are a Zipcar-like hourly service to the public? Is that a market failure that we are willing to challenge? And so my guess is that if Metro had a couple Zipcars out front of Seattle Children's that were wheelchair accessible, that would have solved your problem. Nice hourly rate, not too expensive, not too cheap. Hey, that's a market failure. And also the area of accessible taxi service. The response rate for someone trying to get an accessible taxi is wildly divergent from someone who's ambulatory with no disability. Is that a market failure that we should tackle seriously? I think transit agencies could have a role in this if we demanded it. If we said that we want our transit agency to leverage technologies to match the private market and to deliver things when the private market fails to deliver them, we can do that. It's a choice.
Is it a voter's choice, a legislator's choice? Whose choice?
It's our choice, our electeds. So they can make the decisions.
I think that's a good place to. Oh, sorry, one more, and then we'll end.
Brian Jennings here. Yesterday, during one of the topics, somebody brought up that the government doesn't like funding redundancy. And one of the things that I keep hearing come up is, people, want to have consistency in their rides, but then if the person's not available, then there's, they have to try to find someone else. And there's 27 different agencies that you're using, to provide services for people that, and even with public transit that if buses go away, that light rail isn't really a good alternative for every single person out there. What are your thoughts about changing the look on redundancy and actually making it a goal to have more redundancy, especially in the paratransit area, and changing the mindset out there that we shouldn't be funding redundancy and instead be thinking, how can we make our system robust and redundant? I come from an aerospace background. I was in the Air Force for 20 years, and I mean, triple redundancy is like the standard, and the FAA pushes it. Why don't we have a similar standard for triple redundancy in our paratransit and our transportation networks that are so vulnerable to disruption, as we saw in like the pandemic, and you know, from day to day can be disrupted.
And that may actually end up being cheaper, as it turns out.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Thought-provoking ideas, for sure. Well, thank you for joining us this year and for this session. I know we didn't come up with solutions to this particular thorny problem, but I think a lot of really good ideas were exchanged. And I do have optimism about where things are going. I think we're seeing a sea change out there, both with respect to data standards, specifications, and how the data is being handled, collected, and stewarded. And so we hope that you'll continue to join us in these discussions, because it's really crucial to not just think heavily about these data, but also understand how it impacts the real lives of real people and real rides and their experiences. Thank you so much.